And turning our focus to West Africa now, where Senegal has joined its neighbors to shut doors on its former colonial power, France.
Senegal breaks the silence. A nation begins to reclaim its soul. Something is shifting in Senegal. Quietly, then boldly, the country is beginning to carve out a new direction, one that confronts its colonial past and reclaims control over its future. At the heart of this transformation is President Fa Diam, a relatively new leader, but one already drawing comparisons to Burkina Faso's revolutionary captain Ibrahim Traoré. Until recently, President Diam walked a cautious line. He spoke about redefining Senegal's relationship with France, but never went so far as to sever ties. In fact, in 2024, he visited France with messages of partnership and cooperation. But over the past few months, something changed. Diam stopped speaking in diplomatic riddles and began acting with conviction. Senegal, it seems, is done sitting on the fence. His administration's first symbolic step? Renaming the streets. It may sound simple, routine even, but the decision runs much deeper than fresh signage. In Senegal, as in many parts of Africa, the names of streets, monuments, and public buildings are remnants of colonial rule. In Dakar, nearly 60% of public spaces are still named after French officials, some of whom played active roles in colonization, exploitation, and even dehumanization of African people. One of the busiest highways in Dakar, for example, is called Boulevard General de Gaulle, named after the architect of France's post-colonial strategy. Under Charles de Gaulle's leadership, African nations were granted independence, on paper. In reality, France held on to control in every way that mattered: economics, military power, even currency. Through colonial pacts, African countries were required to give French companies first access to natural resources, maintain French troops on their soil, and deposit a majority of their foreign reserves in the French central bank. That's the legacy President Diam is challenging. For local residents like Matarseh, a meat vendor in Dakar, the issue isn't abstract. "Why are our streets still named after men who saw us as inferior?" he asked in a local interview. "You don't go to Rome or Paris and find monuments named after African rulers. So why should we accept this? It's a fair question. Senegal has its own icons, its own heroes, its own story, and now the country is beginning to tell it." In December 2024, in direct response to public pressure, President Diam launched the National Council for Memory and Historical Heritage. The task, to reclaim Senegal's identity, starting with the names on its buildings, parks, and streets. Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko, a vocal figure in Senegal's political reform movement, was appointed to lead the effort. But the plan doesn't stop with street signs. Education, the most powerful tool of cultural influence, is also being rewritten. For decades, African students across the continent have been taught history through a Western lens. Colonizers were portrayed as visionaries. Indigenous civilizations were described as primitive or non-existent. African triumphs were minimized. African tragedies whitewashed. In Senegal, entire generations grew up with limited knowledge of their own history. Textbooks imported from Europe left out the richness of pre-colonial kingdoms, the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, and the real heroes who resisted foreign domination. Books that did center African culture were often removed from classrooms. President Diam's government is changing that. New curriculums are being introduced. Local scholars and historians are stepping in to reframe how young people learn about their country. The goal is not to erase history, it's to correct it, to show that Senegal's story didn't begin with colonization, and that its future doesn't depend on validation from outside powers. This cultural reawakening isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a much larger movement spreading across West Africa, a movement towards sovereignty, identity, and justice. And nowhere is that more evident than in what happened next. In November 2024, just ahead of the 80th anniversary of one of Senegal's darkest historical events, President Diam made a seismic announcement. France's military base in Senegal would be shut down. The base, long seen as a symbol of continued French influence, had become a sore point for many citizens. That same week, across the sea in Paris, French President Emmanuel Macron made a rare admission. He officially acknowledged that French troops were responsible for the massacre of Senegalese soldiers in 1944. It's known as the Thiaroye Massacre. After fighting bravely for the French army during World War II, hundreds of West African soldiers were shipped back home, unpaid and disrespected. When they demanded what they were owed, they were met with bullets. Official reports say 24 were killed. Survivors insist the real number was closer to 300. France covered it up for decades. It wasn't taught in schools. A film about the massacre was banned. Even in Senegal, the story was censored. It took 80 years and mounting political pressure for France to finally admit the truth. President Diam welcomed Macron's recognition, but he made it clear, words are not enough. Real sovereignty, he said, means having control, not just over your textbooks or your street signs, but over your land and your army. He went on, can you imagine Senegal having a military base in France, or China, or Russia? Of course not. For the Senegalese people, that statement wasn't just rhetorical. It was a long-awaited declaration of self-respect. President Diam clarified that Senegal's decision to remove French troops wasn't a rejection of cooperation. The country still trades heavily with France. In fact, China remains its largest trade and investment partner, and yet there are no Chinese military bases on Senegalese soil. Economic ties can continue, but without military presence. As of February 2025, both governments have agreed to a full withdrawal of French troops by the end of the year. A special commission has been created to manage the departure and the handover of facilities. Meanwhile, the two countries are working on a new defense and security partnership, one that reflects equality, not legacy. Senegal isn't alone in this movement. In Burkina Faso, where President Ibrahim Traoré leads a similar anti-colonial charge, symbolic changes are sweeping the nation. Boulevard Charles de Gaulle in Ouagadougou has been renamed Boulevard Thomas Sankara, honoring the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987. The change was marked by a national ceremony, where Traoré laid the foundation stone for a new Sankara mausoleum. That act, replacing a colonizer's name with that of a freedom fighter, spoke volumes. It echoed through the Sahel and beyond. And as we'll explore in Part 2, this is more than symbolism. From renaming streets to rewriting national anthems in local languages, Africa's journey toward identity and independence is just getting started. Language, identity, and the battle for the African mind. What's happening in Senegal and Burkina Faso isn't just about street names or foreign troops. It's about something far deeper. It's about identity. It's about finally reclaiming the right to tell your own story in your own words. Take Burkina Faso again. President Traoré's government isn't stopping at renaming streets. In a move that surprised many and stirred national pride, they announced that the country's national anthem, originally written in French, would be translated and performed in 14 local languages. That might sound small, but it's not. Language has always been one of the most powerful tools of control. When colonial powers took over African territories, their first target wasn't just land, it was culture. They branded local traditions as backward. They replaced indigenous names with foreign ones. They banned native languages in schools, and in their place, they installed European systems, European laws and European tongues, French, Portuguese, English. Those languages weren't just for communication. They were instruments of domination. They taught Africans how to follow orders, but not how to challenge them. They taught obedience, not self-determination. Education under colonialism was never about empowerment. It was about compliance. And in many African countries, the echoes of that system are still there. Schools that prioritize rote memorization over critical thinking. Curriculums filled with European history while African empires, heroes, and innovations are barely mentioned. Languages of the colonizers still dominate classrooms, courtrooms, and parliaments, while speaking your mother tongue might earn you mockery or punishment. In some places, young Africans grow up speaking only French or English. They can't even hold a conversation in the language their grandparents spoke. That's not just a language barrier, that's cultural amnesia, and it's finally being challenged. Burkina Faso's anthem shift is part of a much larger national strategy to rebuild pride from the inside out. Translating the anthem into local languages is just one step. The country is also working to restructure its education system to reflect its own values, cultures, and needs, not outdated colonial templates. Across the Sahel, similar shifts are unfolding. In Côte d'Ivoire, streets once named after French presidents like François Mitterrand and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing now bear the names of local legends like Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the country's first president. In Tanzania, the city of Dar es Salaam has been quietly scrubbing away colonial markers and replacing them with monuments to post-independence leaders and cultural icons. And back in Senegal, Ousmane Sonko, now a key political figure and reform advocate, didn't wait to be president to start decolonizing public space. As a mayor in Dakar, he famously renamed one of the city's major avenues from Avenue Charles de Gaulle to Peace Street. He also oversaw the removal of other colonial-era signposts, and installed names that celebrated Senegal's own leaders, thinkers, and artists. These are more than cosmetic changes. They're part of a broader mental shift, one that recognizes how symbols shape self-worth and how public memory influences national identity. Think about it. Every day, a young student walks past a school named after a man who viewed her ancestors as savages. Every day, she studies from textbooks that erase her people's victories and amplify their defeats. Every day she's told, directly or indirectly, that greatness sounds foreign. Now imagine how different it feels to walk past a monument honoring someone who looked like you, spoke like you, fought for your freedom. That kind of representation isn't just inspiring, it's necessary. Because without identity, there's no unity. And without unity, there's no lasting progress. Look closer, and you'll see how many of Africa's current struggles can be traced back to the artificial borders and fractured identities left behind by colonial powers. When Europe carved up the continent, it did so without regard for language, culture, or kinship. Entire ethnic groups were split across countries. Former rivals were forced to coexist under a single flag. The result? Deep-rooted tension. Take Mali. The conflict there dates back to 2013, when the Tuareg, a historically marginalized group, rose up against the central government. What started as a local grievance escalated into a regional crisis, opening the door to extremist groups and foreign interventions that have destabilized the entire Sahel. Or consider Nigeria. With over 250 ethnic groups, it's one of the most diverse countries on the continent. But since independence, leadership has largely rotated between just two major groups, the Hausa and the Yoruba. Meanwhile, smaller communities have long felt excluded, fueling cycles of resentment and unrest. These divisions didn't form naturally. They were engineered, and they were maintained, intentionally or not, by post-independence governments that kept old colonial systems intact instead of replacing them with inclusive, locally grounded alternatives. But things are beginning to change. Today's generation of African leaders, activists, and thinkers are pushing back. They're not just tearing down colonial statues. They're building something new in their place, something that belongs to them. And language is at the heart of it. Because language carries more than words, it carries memory, philosophy, humor, wisdom. When you lose your language, you lose access to centuries of knowledge passed down through stories, songs, and proverbs. You lose the voice of your ancestors. Look at what's happening in schools. Countries like Senegal are taking a hard look at their textbooks and asking, whose version of history are we teaching? For too long, students learned about Napoleon before they learned about Shaka Zulu. They studied the French Revolution before hearing about the Kingdom of Mali or the Benin Empire. That's no accident. That's colonial residue. In many cases, even the structure of education, long hours of memorization, reward for obedience over creativity, mirrors the systems introduced by colonial administrators. These systems weren't meant to create inventors or nation builders. They were meant to create workers, loyal, efficient, and silent. But now, there's a new wave of reform. One that values indigenous knowledge, celebrates local heroes, and encourages learning in local languages. Countries are starting to see education not just as a way to catch up to the world, but as a tool to understand their own. This goes beyond the classroom. Look at music, fashion, art. In city after city, young Africans are blending tradition with modernity, turning kente cloth into couture, turning folk rhythms into global hits, using ancestral languages in hip-hop and spoken word. They're proving that culture doesn't have to be imported to be valuable. It doesn't need Western validation to be meaningful. This cultural pride is spreading, and the political class is beginning to catch up. In the past few years, a pattern has emerged. One by one, African nations have started rejecting foreign military presence. Mali did it, then Burkina Faso, then Niger, and now Senegal. It's not just about removing troops, it's about sending a message. The era of foreign countries treating Africa like a geopolitical chessboard is ending. African nations are no longer comfortable being treated as launching pads for foreign operations or buffer zones in global rivalries. At the same time, these nations are forging new kinds of partnerships. Ones not built on dependency, but on mutual respect. Trade with China has grown. Relationships with Turkey, Russia, and Middle Eastern nations have evolved. But there's a new awareness. Partnership cannot come at the expense of sovereignty. As Senegal's President Fadm said during a recent press conference, we are not anti-West, we are pro-Senegal. That single sentence captures the new mood across the continent. And while change is happening at the highest levels of power, it's also happening in everyday places. At village meetings where elders talk openly about historical injustices, at cultural festivals celebrating forgotten rituals, in youth forums where students demand to learn in their mother tongues. The movement is organic, it's grassroots, and it's growing. But none of this comes without risk. Standing up to old powers has consequences. Aid might be withheld, diplomatic tensions might flare, and domestic leaders who challenge the status quo often find themselves under pressure, from within and abroad. Just look at what happened in Burkina Faso. When Captain Traoré announced plans to rewrite the national anthem and remove French troops, he was praised by some but criticized by others. International media questioned his legitimacy. Western powers raised eyebrows, and regional bodies, often influenced by former colonial powers, issued warnings, but still the changes moved forward. That persistence in the face of pushback is what defines this new generation of African leadership. It's not just about slogans or speeches, it's about real, tangible shifts, from education reforms to cultural preservation, from economic diversification to digital sovereignty. And digital sovereignty is a key next step. Many African countries still rely on Western tech platforms, Western cloud servers, and Western communication tools to run their digital infrastructure. That's a vulnerability. In an era where data is power, true independence will mean building African-controlled tech systems, not just consuming global ones. Countries like Rwanda and Kenya are beginning to invest heavily in local startups and homegrown technology. Nigeria's tech sector is booming with talent. Senegal is pushing for digital inclusion and African-led innovations in education, healthcare, and agriculture. If Africa is going to own its future, it must own its tools. And yet, even with all this progress, the journey is far from over. The psychological scars of colonization run deep. The global systems that perpetuate inequality, from trade agreements to lending institutions, still favor the powerful. And inside many African countries, corruption, elitism, and foreign dependency haven't disappeared. So what's next? There's no single answer. But one thing is becoming clear: Africa's path forward won't be found in imitation, it will be found in introspection. By rediscovering the wisdom of elders, the innovation of its youth, and the strength of its cultures, the continent is slowly shaping a vision that is truly its own. This vision doesn't reject the world, it joins it, but on equal footing. And as one observer in Dakar recently said, we've spent decades asking for permission. Now we're giving ourselves the green light. These shifts, in how nations speak, learn, govern, and remember, are not isolated. They are signs of an awakening. Africa may not be fully free yet, but it is freer today than it was yesterday. And with every renamed street, every reprinted textbook, every anthem sung in a local dialect, it inches closer to the future it deserves. A future rooted not in borrowed narratives, but in its own. If this story moved you, if you believe Africa deserves to tell its own story, in its own voice, we want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments, like the video to support this work. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in this powerful journey. Africa is not rising because someone gave it permission. Africa is rising because it finally remembered who it is.